Stranded on stilts on the bank of the Great Ouse River, 14 miles from Cambridge, having completed my polemical textbook of 1986, I was in worse plight than ever before. How could I endure life as an indigene? Rather uncertainly, I decided to do some desultory fieldwork in my childhood hinterland, the Cambridgeshire Fens. I cannot claim to have been told about webbed feet in the Fens, such as I actually described in a book by a certain Fen physician, but as I was looked after in my infancy by a horrible Cambridgeshire nursemaid, she may have frightened me with some Fen stories. It is interesting that my younger sister, who had the advantage of a very superior Cambridgeshire nurse, writes, "I think I grew up with the ideas that Fen people were different, dark, strong, and somehow dangerous, but special nevertheless." Although my sister happens to be a psychoanalyst, she doesn't know where these ideas came from. My paper, Who Were the Fen People?, published in the august Proceedings of the Cambridge Antiquarian Society in 1992, relates to Fenlanders from c. 1800 to c. 1950, for everything changed soon after the Second World War, when, as a result of the amazing agricultural revolution, Fen workers assumed new roles. In that period of 1.5 centuries, most Fenlanders were employed farm workers, resembling farm workers in non-Fen country, and or peat cutters. They were not freelancers who sloshed about as hunter-gatherers. Those who believe in the hunter-gatherers are still living in the 18th century, ignoring the agricultural revolution which occurred in the Fens as long ago as the first half of the 19th century. Apart from the large number of farm labourers, there were local people, always known as smallholders, who cultivated small areas without the help of employed labour, except possibly at harvest. And there were farmers proper, not necessarily local people, who were those responsible for farming most of the land with the help of employed farm labourers. The work of draining the Fens, and I refer here to the East Anglian Fens, whether they be situated in Cambridgeshire, Suffolk or Norfolk, not to the Silt Fens further north. The work of draining the Fens started in 1631, and for 6 years the fenlands were filled with thousands of men cutting huge channels such as the old Bedford level across the landscape. The Civil War interrupted the work, but by 1652 it was completed, the new Bedford River having been added by then. The wise men of Cambridge University were opposed to the general drainage of the Fens, which started, were opposed to the general drainage of the Fens. They urged that the Cam would have its stream dried up by the drainage, and as Cambridge is concerned in its river, I quote, "so the well-being of the whole country, yea, of the whole kingdom, is concerned in Cambridge and its university, and the stream of knowledge would be dried up with the stream of Cam." However, the wise men did not really need to worry, for this original drainage scheme was a great calamity, owing to the resultant shrinkage of the peat. As the water was removed from the vast thickness of peat, the surface dried out, peat compacted, and the land sank. Huge floods covered the peat fens, which were then lower than the northern silt fens, and Denver Sluice to the north, which controlled the waters of the new and old Bedford rivers, collapsed in 1713, resulting in watery chaos. The sluice was not rebuilt until 1750, and it was a long time before the drainage based on windmills, more properly wind pumps, which were initially privately owned, could be acclaimed as a success. The life of the Fenlanders has been little studied in this modern historical period. The notable Fen historians, with hardly an exception, have been medievalists, such as Margaret Spafford, or others who have stopped short of the re-drainage period. The renowned historical geographer Darby followed up his first book, The Medieval Fenland, with many publications on the re-drainage. His work was highly regarded for good reasons, but a sociological approach was generally lacking, and the glamorous history of the drains has ousted the mundane history of the people. Despite much persistence in the excellent records room of the Cambridgeshire County Council, I myself remain totally baffled by the subject of land tenure in the 19th century Fenland. I cannot begin to answer such a simple question as who was in a position to take up newly drained land. I certainly found it much easier and much more agreeable to study land tenure in certain regions of West Africa than in the re-drained Cambridgeshire Fens. In fact, to my great misery, I was obliged to give up, which accounts for the meagreness of my Fen publications. When gossiping about my Fen work in a milieu which I made a note of ordinary middle-class Cambridge, university people and others, the sort of people who are apt to drop in for lunch at my college Clare Hall, when gossiping about my work in such circles, I soon found myself up against stereotyped walls of prejudice which were insusceptible to rational argument. While it might be thought that this was partly because everyone, with hardly an exception, had read the novel Waterland by Graham Swift, which was later to be made into a film, it was rather the other way round, that Swift, as a sensitive romantic writer, wrote about a mythical Fenland which satisfied the emotional needs of non-Fen people, particularly those resident in the flat and boring landscape around Cambridge City. The author, like his readers, was possessed of a deep feeling of what Fenland life must have been like, although to his own admission he'd scarcely been there. His geography and place names were fictional, and the main theme was murder at a lock gate. The book is described on its jacket as being not just a superb evocation of place, but also a vision of England and the strange, stubborn English temperament. The Fens were fascinating, both because they were so peculiar and because they were so English. Note those words, the strange, stubborn English temperament. This Fenland, this palpable earth raised out of the flood by centuries of toil, no mention of the collapse of Denver Sluice, is a magical and miraculous land. Fenland, I quote, is an ambiguous, amphibious domain through which we have all travelled, where past and present intermingle, where the drama of loss and reclamation is written in the landscape, where fable and illusion stalk the first vistas of fact. It is a book about beer, eels, the French Revolution, the end of the world, windmills, will-o'-the-wisps, murder, love, education, curiosity, and supremely the malign, merciful element of water.
That's from the Gus jacket, is it?
Yes. In working on the Fens, I made use of the wonderful unpublished census statistics by household, which were first collected in 1841, and which, owing to the operation of a 100-year secrecy rule, are available only until 1891. These statistics are available on microfiche in the County Record Office in Shire Hall. That office is packed out by individuals pursuing their family histories, but few academics are to be found there. After spending many a long month inspecting these figures, I think that in most respects they are surprisingly reliable, perhaps partly because the census enumerators gathered information from women, the men being out on the farms when they called. Thus the ages of children, judging from successive decennial censuses, were usually rather accurately recorded. I cannot understand why Cambridge historians ignore these figures. What a goldmine they ought to be. Imagine arriving at a locality in the rural tropical world and being handed statistics by a household in, say, 1851, which recorded the names of all members, including children, as well as the relationship to the household head, age, and birthplace. Of course, enumerators sometimes found it difficult to determine the main occupation of the male householder. There were few female householders, and the statistics which were supposed to be provided on the areas of farm holdings and numbers of labourers employed appear to be quite unreliable. Modern historians are really remarkably casual in their acceptance of census material as gospel. For some decades after 1841, the published census figures, which were of course bulked, were the only source of information on numbers of farmers and their acreages. These figures are always complacently accepted as accurate by historians who do not bother to study the microfiche, which would have shown them how often the figures were rounded by those individual cultivators who didn't think in terms of total acreages. Fenlanders had a mobile outlook, the basis of which was that sons always left the parental cottage on marriage, often moving elsewhere to find a new labouring job and marrying a girl from another village. In Iceland Fen, an area near Iceland where I worked, the only sons who were an exception to this rule were the sons of publicans, whose habitations were superior. In Iceland Fen, all the four publicans in 1851 were important people who were also farmers or smallholders. They provided the continuity which was lacking in other families, and their families tended to intermarry. Although a male publican was often succeeded by his widow, the public houses provided social centres for men only. Women had nowhere to go except to the Baptist chapel erected in 1841. The population of Iceland Fen, to the north of Iceland village, reached its peak in 1851, the same being true of each of the Fen parishes. Between 1851 and 1861, something extraordinary happened in Cambridgeshire. The population, after rising very steadily since 1801, suddenly fell by 5%. There was no other English county which suffered a larger decrease, and there were only 3 other counties where the population did not increase. While this remarkable change, remarkable within the whole English context, affected Cambridgeshire generally, for a majority of parishes showed some population decline, it was particularly consistent and marked in the parishes within the area of the peaked fens, both east and west of the Bedford rivers. So it seems that many Fenlanders, far from being embedded in ignorant isolation in the fens, were alert to the possibilities offered by removal, mainly to northern cities. There was also some emigration overseas.
Several times you've used the word hinterland.
Yes.
And I know that this is a sort of theme in a lot of your work. There's the city view of things, as you mentioned in Bangalore. The people in the Institute have a view of these country people. But there's a hinterland to all these cities and these urban areas. And it's into these hinterlands you've gone and exposed many of the myths
Yes.
about them.
Yes. So this paper, of which I've only given you excerpts, was a sort of disquisition on the concept of hinterland.
Yes. And you think that the sort of denigration of the people living in the hinterland is largely a fear of the unknown and...
Yes. Apart from the demographic misbeliefs, which were profound, including the presumed high rate of incest, inquiries were made, but they weren't made anywhere else. And had they been, they would have shown that everywhere there was a much higher rate of incest than had been imagined. Apart from these demographic points, it was widely believed that the consumption of opium in the Fens in the last century was very high, the belief being based on the presumptions that Fenlanders suffered from very bad health and are known to have grown poppies. A woman called Virginia Berridge, about whom I know nothing, has written 3 articles which are largely repetitive, purporting to prove on the basis of the flimsiest evidence that opium use was as normal for the people of the Fens as it was for Coleridge and De Quincey. We should remember that in the 1850s opium could be bought in any shop. Charles Kingsley related that it was obtainable in Cambridge on market day, so that there were habitual users, including Charles Darwin's elder brother Erasmus, who never did a stroke of work in his life. I wanted to end my paper, which is a disquisition on hinterland, with some notes towards the definition of hinterland, but unfortunately I lack the necessary philosophical training. I can see some of the questions, but I can provide no answers. Is a hinterland necessarily partly imaginary? Do the indigenes of the hinterland itself regard those I have denoted as the indigenes as occupying a hinterland? In other words, what do hunter-gatherers think of arable farmers? Is a hinterland necessarily threatening? Is a hinterland necessarily exotic? Does a hinterland provide protection from something worse, etc.? You may wonder why I've provided no evidence that the Cambridgeshire Fenlanders were wild amphibious men before the re-drainage of the 18th century. This is because I can find no good description of them except that provided by Daniel Defoe, whose journey began in 1722, soon after the collapse of Denver Sluice. After saying that the fens near Ely Cathedral were covered with water and fogs, he observed that it was impossible not to pity the many thousands of families confined in those fogs and vapours. But notwithstanding this, the people, especially those that are used to it, live unconcerned and as healthy as other folks, except now and then an ague, which they make light of, and there are great numbers of very ancient people among them. is hardly a description of wild amphibious men. I was very dissatisfied with my Fen work, which I abandoned some years ago. I was much more satisfied by studying the position of middle-class women from about 1860 to 1900, with special reference to the earliest students of Newnham and Girton colleges. See my article in the May 1966 issue of the Cambridge Review.
Yeah, got that. It's difficult to say, but what was the main surprise you had when you came to study Cambridge women?
A main surprise was the extraordinary belief that became fashionable about 1880, when it was seen that women did very well at examinations. The opponents of women changed their tune and argued that it was unfortunate that for physiological reasons women were not capable of academic work, and it damaged or rather they might be capable of passing examinations, but at the expense of their reproductive mechanisms.
So previously they'd been thought to be too stupid.
Yes.
And now that they were clearly intelligent enough.
That's right.
They had a view of the whole body, in which overdevelopment of one part led to the underdevelopment of another part.
That's right.
It's a kind of
yes.
zero-sum game, isn't it?
Yes, and this wasn't only believed in Cambridge, it was a common belief.
Yes.
About women at that time, and that was the greatest surprise I received. This work was made possible because the registers, the biographical registers of Newnham and Girton, especially of Girton, are extraordinarily good, superior to any registers compiled by men's colleges. And so one has information relating to students from the earliest times, which has never been properly analysed and in a scientific kind of way.
What details did they include?
Most of what you would expect. But they are defective, of course, and because they are somewhat defective, people dismiss them altogether. But you have to use them with discretion. For instance, although they record the number of children born to those who married, the number is clearly too low. That's an example, but you just can observe this. But what you can also observe is the extraordinary significance of this demographic change that occurred around 1870. Mrs. Sidgwick did some work which showed that the students before 1880 or so belonged to families with an average of 6.8 children. But the students themselves had families of 1, 2, or 3. There were no large families. It was a complete change.
Was this, I remember you had a very interesting appendix or footnote on contraception. Was this related to that? That was the mechanism.
I don't think so, and I think this is a very interesting question. I have been speaking to Peter Laslett recently, and I don't think he thinks so. Contraception had been available for a long time, but I don't think it was much used. I think, to put it as a joke, sexual intercourse went out of fashion towards the end of the 19th century.
Often it's said that as you say, that it wasn't artificial contraceptives, but that it was coitus interruptus.
Yes, I take account of that, but I was one does fear that abstention and coitus interruptus were very, very common. But most unfortunately, there is no information relating to individual cases. There are some good books on sexuality in the 19th century by one Mason. And he says, I mean, most unfortunately, if you look in memoirs, letters, anything, you simply cannot find any information on this subject. You know nothing.
And you know that the pattern, I mean, this great change you mentioned, around the 1870s
Yes.
might have been accounted by the Malthusian, that is to say that the women who were educated tended to get married much later, and therefore they only had one to three children, whereas they were the daughters of families where the woman had married much earlier. That isn't the case.
I have been remarkably unsuccessful in ascertaining the age of marriage of persons of different classes. And I wish to see, if I continue with this work, I wish to see Peter Leslie again on this. The striking thing about this demographic transition, as it's always called, was that it affected all classes.
Yes.
And occurred at a time when infant mortality, rather, was extremely high. It was extremely high until about 1900. And so it wasn't to do with the fact that you could rely on those who'd been born going on living.
So what do you think it was to do with? Do you have any idea?
I find it mysterious. It was not confined to Britain.
No.
Of course, the French had been using birth control since the early 19th century. But they too suffered from a demographic transition at around the same time as the British did in the 1870s. And there's a debate which, you know, the demographers don't provide an answer.
Well, a person who I know used to think a lot about it is Geoffrey Hawthorne. And he, as you say, there's been work on Portugal, Italy, France, Germany, England, and it shows the same phenomenon, which goes
That's
across
right.
Protestant, Catholic, rural, urban, class divisions. Just sweeps right across. There's no correlation.
Yes.
Very mysterious.
Very mysterious. Very mysterious.
And he's unable to explain it.
Yes.
One or two questions about particular people, if you didn't mind. Something just about your father, A.V. Hill, the Nobel physicist and MP.
Physiologist.
And MP for Cambridge.
University.
University.
Yes.
What sort of memories do you have of him?
He was very much inconvenienced in his life. That word is not appropriate. It was much more than that, by the fact that when he was 3 years old, his father had an affair with a nursemaid, or something of the kind, and he never saw him again. This made my father deeply prejudiced on all sexual matters, because he was afraid that he would go the same way. He never uttered the word father, and I was brought up to believe that he was dead, which annoyed me when I was told that he died when I was about 12 years old.
Your grandfather?
He was called Jonathan Hill, and he was a timber merchant in Bristol.
Jonathan Hilden?
Hill.
Hill.
Yes. I mean, my father, A.V. Hill, was the son of Jonathan Hill, timber merchant of Bristol.
So your father was brought up by his mother?
So he was brought up by his mother, who was very wise in moving to Tiverton, so that he could go as a day boy to a Blundell school, which was an excellent public school, from which he got a scholarship to Trinity.
Yes.
So his career was made in that way.
I see. Do you haven't said anything about him apart from being very damaged in a way, or influenced? I mean, was he a kind father or a distant father, or both many things? You don't need to answer if you don't want to, but there's a picture of him in the corridor at King's College.
There is
my
indeed,
college.
in his lab.
Yes. Which I always pass and think of you and him.
Yes, a charming watercolour. I'm going through rather an awkward phase of thinking a bit ill of him, and I don't really want to record this particularly.
Okay.
Because I see him as having been so sexually conventional, for instance. and I see it as stemming from his most unfortunate experience.
So you understand it, but you still feel right. What about, I think you may feel the same about your mother, because I think she was obviously, you had an elder brother, did you? Or
No, younger brother. We were four. I had two younger brothers.
Yes, and she, like many Victorian, Edwardian mothers, was keener on the sons than the daughters.
Well, certainly when I was born, she had no use for me. Put me in black stockings and cast me out into the arms of a wicked nursemaid, which is recorded in family correspondence. So I'm going through an awkward phase of finding fault with her, and I don't particularly want to record this.
No. When you say wicked housemaid, I mean, you probably got no worry about, I mean, she was just...
Well, she couldn't stand me. But my mind has been widened recently by the fact that I have unexpectedly got two infant granddaughters.
Yes.
And one of them seems to be my reincarnation. I had auburn hair, and she has two. And she's terribly naughty. And so I was the black sheep of the family, but had the misfortune to be the eldest.
Yes.
And I can just see myself resembling Matilda.
So you see some of the problems from the other side.
Yes.
And then not only your mother was presumably a Keynes, was she?
Oh yes, she was her elder brother was John Maynard.
Yes.
Her younger brother was the famous Geoffrey,
yes.
who had this double career. He was a remarkable literary man as well as being a surgeon.
Yes. I wondered if you could just say something about those two mothers' brothers.
Well, I have written about Maynard because I edited a volume of the letters of Lydia and Maynard.
Yes, I got that.
You have. And in the introduction to those letters I have written about him. I feel much affinity with Maynard and often think about him and can't believe that he's been dead 50 years. I recently was asked by the World Service to make some remarks about him, commemorating the 50th anniversary of his death. He's a very constant presence in my life.
What affinities did you feel towards him?
Can't say.
Just an affinity.
Yes, just a...
He was a polymath, wasn't he? Interested in so many different things.
Yes, of course he wrote this treatise on probability.
Yes.
His father, as I have already said, was a moral scientist. And I criticise Maynard for not having realised what he derived from his excellent father,
Yes.
who was a demure man, who, as I mentioned before, became registrar of the university, who was totally devoid of ambition, but who must have had more of an influence on Maynard than he was prepared to admit. Phyllis Dean has nearly finished a wonderful biography of John Neville Keynes, which I hope will be published.
Very good. What about the younger brother, Geoffrey?
Well, he was an astonishing man because he led a double life. He was a full-time surgeon at Barts.
Yes.
A great authority on Blake, as you will know.
Yes.
And worked every evening on his literary work. I mean, at an early age, soon after the war, he produced a completed non-such edition of Blake's publications.
Yes.
His sons were very annoyed about it because they said they never saw him. He had 4 sons.
He would tend to come back from the day at the hospital and disappear into his study, and that was it.
Yes, and at the weekend he used to have medical students round to visit him. And
you remember him as a person?
yes, he had no use for females.
Was that the case with John Maynard as well, or not?
Oh no. Geoffrey always tried to show his Blake pictures to my brother, who wasn't in the least interested. I'm a freak in our family because I'm interested in such matters as art and poetry. My father had no interest in any such thing. I mean, he was extremely limited in his outlook. And the others weren't interested either.
Keynes was. I mean, John Maynard was. He collected paintings.
Oh, yes, of course.
And poetry.
Oh, yes. I mean, that's why he married Lydia, because he felt himself to be needing to be expanded.
Yes.
People are so absurd. They say, why did two such different people marry? Well, the answer was that Maynard found Lydia so literary and artistic, and wasn't sure that he was himself, having been brought up in such a bourgeois, boring home with such dreadful furniture.
Yes. What about the other Keynes, Milo Keynes? What relative is he?
He's a first cousin. He's the third son of Geoffrey.
And what does he do? I know the name.
He was a surgeon at one time, but recently he's been doing excellent work on the health of famous men, which he publishes in eminent places like the Royal Society. I mentioned that he'd written a long article on Newton.
Yes.
There are four of them, and Richard Keynes was the professor of physiology in Cambridge, now retired, of course.
Yes. There's a Simon Keynes, who must be some relative.
He's the son of Geoffrey.
Is he? Anglo-Saxon scholar.
In fact, 3 of these 11 fellows that I mentioned are the sons of Richard. Is it 3? Or is it 2? Anyhow, there's Simon Keynes, who's an Anglo-Saxon scholar at Trinity, and there's another fellow at Trinity, curiously, which is a rather unusual thing, who's a scientist.
Are you, I mean, Cambridge has these various academic families who are interrelated. Are you interrelated with any other of the Cambridge?
Our branch of the family isn't, but of course Richard Keynes is, because he married Adrian's daughter.
Ah, yes. Lord Adrian.
The first Lord Adrian.
Yes.
The second Lord Adrian unfortunately died recently.
But you were related, for instance, to Nicholas Humphrey.
He is my nephew.
Your nephew, yes. And hence into our department to Caroline Humphrey.
Yes.
I was wondering, the other question I wanted to, well, there are 2 other questions. One was just to ask you whether, you mentioned Meyer several times, Meyer Fortis, whether there was any other, either anthropologist or economist or any academic who had, you think, influenced you in your work?
Well, in my young days I was very admiring of Joan Robinson, who was my supervisor.
Yes.
I did meet her in Trivandrum, of all places, towards the end of her life,
Yes.
because she used to visit Trivandrum regularly.
Yes.
Her health was very bad and she didn't live long after that.
Yes.
But, well, the African Studies Centre was a wonderful centre for me, and as I've said, there was Thomas Hodgkin there. And Wilkes.
So those were, so it's more African historians. So
Yes, those were the people I knew, and unfortunately Hodgkin died in 1972, which is a tragedy. Wilkes is flourishing in Wales.
And you know the current director of the African Studies Centre quite well, Keith Hart.
Oh yes, I know Keith Hart well.
How do you know
Yes.
him? You've known him for some years.
Oh, I can't say what the origins of my knowing Keith Hart are.
The other question is really about how you work. How do you, I'm interested in how people actually write and so on. You talked earlier, but you don't use any kind of electronic gadgets, but do you write easily, in longhand, heavily prepared, or how do you work?
Until recently I typed everything on one of these huge manual typewriters.
Yes.
And I always went through many drafts, and I left the first draft sit down for at least a month
Yes.
before having a look at it and always deciding it was abominable. The only thing is to take a deep breath and write what you think at the time is wonderful,
Yes.
and then you read it and you find it's abominable.
Yes.
And this is, of course, as we were discussing earlier, one of the bases of my objection to word processes,
Yes.
because let it lie latent and come back and start afresh.
Mm.
And so I used to type, as I was such a good touch typist, I used to
So what would you do with
retype.
the first draft? You would just put it on one side?
Oh,
and
throw
then-
it away, but I mean, I would use it as the basis for another draft,
I see.
but I would throw it away, but I
Yes.
would completely redo it,
Yes.
and I might do that 4 times.
Yes.
I rewrote enormously.
Mm. 4 times you do it.
I think so. I think 4 might be
Mm.
because if I laid it aside and then came back, I always found that I didn't like it, and the quickest way to proceed was then to just retype
Mm.
completely.
Yes. Looking at it from time to time.
Yes, that's right.
But rewrite
Yes.
it. Did you enjoy that actual process of writing or
I
not?
was always a very nervous writer. I always felt that my inspiration was about to give up.
Mm.
I had 6 books published by the Cambridge University Press. I started writing when I was really young, because I mentioned that I wrote a book when I was with the Fabians before the war.
Yes.
So I suppose I was a person who found it necessary to write.
Mm.
Mm.
So it was not exactly a pleasure, but something you felt you could do and should do.
Yes, and I'm not able to work in the evening.
When do you work best?
I work best in the morning,
Mm.
but I would always stop working between 5 and 6.
Mm.
Absolutely impossible. My brain's no good at all in the evening.
You'd work in the afternoon as well?
Yes. Mm. Well, when I was in the village of Barticarau in Houseland, I used to talk to people in the morning and type my notes in the afternoon.
Yes.
Fortunately, my archives, that is to say my field notes, which are all typed, so I'm a very, very good anthropologist from that
Yes.
point of view, are in a splendid library. They're at the Africana Library at Northwestern University, which is reputed to be the best Africana library in the world.
Mm. That's excellent.
They asked me to send them.
Mm.
This was because Ivor Wilkes was there, and of course it's through his influence that they asked me to send them.
Yes.
Mm.
That's good.
And if I want anything, but at the moment I don't think I ever again will want anything, I only have to send for it and they'll send me a photocopy, you see, so it doesn't matter that it's as far away as Northwestern.
That's excellent.
They're extremely efficient.
Did you index your field notes in any way?
I always index everything,
Mm.
most elaborately,
Mm. Before you
because I
start?
have an abominable memory. I'm surprised I haven't told you before.
Mm.
I'm most inconvenienced by my abominable memory,
Mm.
so that I have to index everything, and I always have,
How did you index it? In what way?
and cards,
On
conventional
by
way.
subjects.
yes. Mm.
Everything on property or everything on.
Yes, I mean, you'd find a card for donkeys, as it were.
Yes.
Mm.
And you keep this card and then go right through and add further references.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, a tin box with cards in.
Have you? Did
Yes.
you send that to?
No, I didn't send that to Northwestern.
That was probably a rather important part of it if you finally get them to ask you for it.
Oh, I don't think so. No.
Well, finally, well, you were just going to end with something there, but was there anything else you wanted to reflect on, comment on in your life and experiences?
Well, I would say my extraordinary good fortune, after suffering greatly by my inability to get into academia in arriving in Ghana, which I have emphasized strongly already, my extraordinary good fortune in giving birth to my daughter when I was 42 years old, after having had medical problems. Those 2 things are of extraordinary importance to me, and I feel extremely fortunate. And so after a slow start, I feel that I've been very lucky.
Well, you've made a very distinguished contribution, if I may say so, Polly, so I'm going to just let you had something that you wanted to just end up with.
Yes. Just at the moment, July 1996, I'm in the doldrums again. A certain influential women seem to be opposed to my unconventional, indeed eccentric, anthropological approach to the early women students. As I am so dreadfully sensitive to opposition, I fancy I shall now abandon that work. It occurs to me that I am well qualified to write about Cambridge as a military centre in the 1914 to 18 war. Hospitals in the backs, wounded victims of the Somme in the arches of Neville's court in Trinity. There should be a lot of useful material in the Cambridgeshire room, in the collection of newspapers in the Cambridgeshire room of the City Council.
Well, that would be extremely nice and interesting, and as we discussed earlier, would have some link in some way with Pat Barker's work on rivers and the war.
Yes, it's not disconnected with the fact that I became so infatuated by Pat Barker.
Yes. But I think perhaps we'll end there, and I'll comment on the other bit of it. But thank you very much indeed, Polly.
Thank you, Alan. It's been very good of you to take such a lot of trouble.